The air of the unknown planet was thin but breathable. Elias adjusted the small device on his wrist, letting it scan the atmosphere once more. The green light blinked steady, telling him it was safe enough. He stepped out of the small landing shuttle, boots sinking into the soft earth. The ground glowed faintly in places, as if the soil itself held starlight. Elias was an explorer, not a soldier, not a hero. He worked for the Survey Corps, the part of humanity that mapped new worlds. Most days were routine. Land, scan rocks, gather samples, report back. Yet from the first step on this planet, he felt it was different. The forest around him was alive with colors his eyes had never seen. Trees stretched tall, their branches bending like arches, covered in leaves that shimmered between blue and silver. Streams of light flowed across their trunks like veins. The air carried a sound, a low hum, almost like a whisper too far to catch. Elias slowed his breathing, not wanting to disturb the quiet magic of the place. He walked further, carefully marking his path with small beacons from his pack. His scanner beeped lightly every few seconds, noting the unusual energy fields around him. The planet was not empty. Something had lived here once, or still lived here now. Elias moved past a wall of vines, pushing them aside, and found himself at the edge of a stream. The water sparkled as if dusted with silver powder. He crouched down, dipping a gloved finger into the flow. The water was pure. He let himself smile. But then, he froze. Across the stream, sitting on a stone, was a figure. Addo. First, Elias thought it was a trick of the light. The shape was still quiet, almost blending into the glowing forest. Then the figure moved and his heart leaped. It was a woman, or at least something like one. Her form was tall, slender, her skin pale with a faint glow like moonlight. Her hair, long and flowing, caught the silver of the stream and turned it to strands of light. She sat with her back to him, looking into the water as though lost in thought. Elias's breath caught in his chest. He had seen many strange life forms in his travels, creatures with wings, creatures made of crystal, even creatures that swam through the air. But this was different. There was something human about her posture, the way her shoulders curved, the way she tilted her head. He whispered without thinking, the words slipping out of him as if they were pulled by the moment. "She's the most beautiful I've seen." The words were soft, barely sound, but the forest was quiet enough that they seemed to travel further than he intended. The figure stirred. Slowly, carefully, she turned toward him. Elias's heart pounded. Her face came into view, framed by the silver light of her hair. Her eyes were unlike any he had ever seen. Deep, glowing, not with fire, but with gentle light like the calm of distant stars. She did not speak. She only looked at him as if measuring who he was, what he wanted, whether he was danger or safety. For a long moment neither moved. The only sound was the steady stream carrying silver water past them both. Elias raised his hands slowly, showing he had no weapon. It's all right," he said, though he knew she could not understand him. His voice was calm, low, the way one might speak to a frightened animal. Yet she did not look frightened. She looked curious, cautious, but steady. She tilted, her head slightly, her eyes never leaving him. Then, with the faintest movement, she placed her hand on the surface of the stream. The water shimmered under her touch, light spreading out in ripples. Elias watched, caught between awe and disbelief. She was real. Not a vision, not a story, not a dream born of lonely travels. Real. He wanted to speak again, but his throat was dry. He crouched slowly, reaching for the stream on his side. He touched the water as she had. The cold ran through his glove, and for a moment the ripples from his side met hers in the middle. Her eyes softened. For the first time, she blinked. Something, in that simple act, told Elias he had not broken the moment. He had been accepted, if only just a little. He stayed like that, crouched by the water, not daring to move closer. She, too, did not move away. They stayed separated by the silver stream, bound by silence but connected by something stronger. Minutes passed, though Elias could not tell how many. Time seemed to bend in this place, in her presence. At last, she rose from the stone. Her movements were graceful, flowing, as if she were part of the air itself. She looked down at him once more, her expression unreadable, then turned and began to walk into the forest. Elias stood quickly, his instincts pulling him to follow. But he stopped. To rush after her would break the fragile thread of trust that had barely begun. He could only watch as she disappeared between the glowing trees, her light fading into the distance. When the forest was still again, Elias let out the breath he had been holding. His heart still raced, his mind still spun with questions. Who was she? What was she? And why did he feel that his life had just shifted, that nothing would ever be the same? He sat on the stone she had left behind. The glow of the water reflected on his face. For the first time in his many travels, he felt not like an explorer of empty worlds, but like a guest in a story greater than himself. Somewhere in the forest, she was walking, and he knew without doubt that he would see her again. The whisper he had spoken still lingered in his mind. He had not meant for her to hear, but somehow in that silent exchange by the stream, he wondered if she had understood. She's the most beautiful I've seen. And she had turned toward him. The next morning, Elias woke early. The pale sun of the strange planet was just rising, casting long beams of silver light through the forest canopy. He sat outside his shuttle, staring at the trees. His thoughts returned again and again to the figure he had seen by the stream, the woman with star-like eyes. He still wondered if she had been real. Explorers sometimes spoke of visions when they were alone too long on strange worlds. But Elias knew this was no dream. He remembered the ripples of the stream, the way her hand touched the water, the way she turned to him. That memory was sharp, clear, alive. He packed light equipment into his pack, scanner, food rations, and a small journal. He wanted to see her again. Something deep in him told him she had not walked away forever. The forest greeted him with the same quiet hum, soft and steady, almost like music beneath the leaves. Birds, or what seemed like birds, fluttered through the high branches, their wings glinting like glass. Elias moved carefully, marking his path with beacons, listening for any sound that might guide him. It took him hours, but finally he reached the stream again. The stone where she had sat was empty. The water still shimmered with silver, flowing, without end. Elias waited, crouching near the same spot, touching the water lightly as he had before. Minutes passed. Then hours. The forest shifted in light as the sun climbed higher. Just when Elias began to think she would not come, he saw movement in the distance. She was there. Walking slowly, carefully, as if testing whether it was safe, the woman stepped from behind. The trees. Her hair caught the sunlight, her pale skin glowing faintly as before. She did not speak, but her eyes met his, steady and watchful. Elias's heart leapt, but he kept his movements calm. He sat down on the stone and placed his hands on his knees, showing he would not rush her. She stopped at the edge of the stream, her gaze never leaving him. Then, slowly, she crouched and placed her hand in the water again. The light rippled, out toward him. Elias smiled gently and copied her, dipping his own hand into the stream. Their ripples met in the middle, just as yesterday. For a long time, they did nothing more than this. It was silence, but not empty silence. It was the silence of understanding without words. Elias reached into his pack and pulled out a small object. His journal. He opened it and tore a page, then took a pen and began to draw. He sketched a simple picture of the stream, the trees, and the two of them across the water. When he finished, he held it up for her to see. Her head tilted slightly, and she stepped closer, eyes fixed on the drawing. Slowly she touched her chest, then pointed at the figure he had drawn of her. Elias felt a spark of connection. She understood. He tapped the paper at the figure of himself, then touched his chest. Elias, he said softly, pointing to himself. She blinked once, then lifted her hand. Placing her palm against her chest, she spoke a single word. Her voice, soft but clear, like wind over glass. Leora. Elias froze, then repeated the sound carefully. Leora. Her eyes softened, almost like a smile without lips. She had given him her name. For hours, Elias and Leora exchanged gestures, drawings, and sounds. He sketched stars, pointing to the sky, trying to explain where he came from. She drew a circle in the dirt with strange symbols inside, then pointed to the forest. Elias guessed it meant her people, her home. But there were things she did not explain. Sometimes, when he asked with a gesture, she shook her head, her eyes turning distant, guarded. Elias sensed she carried a secret. Something heavy, something she did not want to share yet. Still, their connection grew. Each small exchange, each drawn picture, each sound, was a step across the silence between their worlds. When the sun dipped, low, painting the forest in soft gold, Leora stood. She touched the stone beside him with her hand, as though marking that place, then turned to leave. Elias stood as well, but he did not follow. He understood that trust could not be forced. She disappeared once more into the glowing forest, leaving him with a mix of wonder and longing. That night, Elias returned to his shuttle and wrote quickly in his journal. He filled pages with sketches of her eyes, her hands, the way she moved. He wrote her name again and again, Leora. But with each word, a question burned stronger in his mind. If she lived here, if her people were here, why had he not seen them? Why did they hide? The answer came sooner than he expected. The next day, Elias returned again to the stream. Leora was waiting for him this time, standing by the water as if she had known he would come. Her expression was serious. She gestured for him to follow. Elias hesitated, then nodded. He packed away his journal and walked after her. She moved quickly but gracefully, leading him deeper into the forest. They crossed streams, climbed over roots, and passed under great arches of stone covered in glowing moss. Finally, they reached a wide clearing. At its center stood ancient stone ruins, pillars cracked but still strong, walls covered in strange carved symbols. The stones hummed faintly, as if remembering voices long gone. Leora walked to one of the walls and placed her hand against the carvings. She looked back at Elias, her eyes asking if he understood. Elias stepped closer, tracing the shapes with his fingers. He could not read them, but he felt their weight. These were records. This was history. Leora crouched and drew in the dirt. She made a shape of a starship, simple but clear. Then she crossed it out. She pointed to the ruins, then to the forest around them. Elias's chest tightened. He understood. Her people had once left this world. They had once reached for the stars. But something had happened. Something had forced them back into hiding, into silence. He looked at her, searching her eyes for more, but she turned away, her gaze hard, distant. She did not want to tell him the rest. Not yet. Still, Elias felt the truth pressing down on him. Leora's people had been betrayed, or harmed, or perhaps hunted. That was why they feared outsiders. That was why they remained hidden. But then, why had she come to him? Why had she spoken her name? As the sun set, Leora led him back to the stream. Before she left, she looked at him long, steady. Then she lifted her hand and touched her chest. Once more, Leora, she repeated softly. Elias touched his chest. Elias. And in that simple exchange, the silence between their worlds grew thinner. Yet in the quiet of his heart, Elias knew this was only the beginning. He had stepped into a secret far larger than himself, and soon he would learn what it meant to truly be trusted or rejected. The forest grew dark, the stars rose overhead. And somewhere in that darkness, Leora's people were watching. The forest was quiet the next morning when Elias returned to the stream. He had barely slept in his shuttle. His mind was filled with the memory of the ruins, the carvings, and the unspoken story Leora had shown him. She was waiting again. This time she stood instead of sitting. When she saw him, she gave the faintest nod as though she had expected him all along. Elias felt a strange warmth. It was not friendship yet, not trust fully, but it was something close. They began their silent routine. He touched the water, she answered. He drew in his journal, and she studied his sketches with curious eyes. But today was different. Today, Leora seemed restless, as though something weighed on her thoughts. After a time, she gestured for him to follow. Elias stood and walked after her. She led him deeper into the forest, past streams and arches of stone, until they reached the ruins. Again, the great pillars rose like broken teeth from the ground. Carvings covered every wall. Elias ran his fingers over the symbols, wishing he could read them. Leora walked to a section of stone half buried in moss. She brushed the green away, revealing new carvings. These were not symbols only. They were pictures. Elias leaned closer. The first picture showed a ship, a great one, rising from the ground with fire beneath it. The second showed many figures standing tall, their arms raised to the stars. The third showed those same figures surrounded by others, figures drawn differently, darker, their shapes sharp and menacing. Then came the last picture. The tall figures were falling, their ships broken, their arms lowered. Above them, the dark figures stood in victory. Elias understood. These ruins told a story. He looked at Leora. She was watching him carefully, her eyes deep and serious. Elias raised his hand, pointing to the dark figures in the stone. He spoke softly, though he knew she might not understand. "Enemies," he whispered. Leora's eyes narrowed. Slowly she nodded. She drew in the dirt then. A circle, small, which she tapped with her hand. Then she drew many small circles around it, each one filled with sharp marks. She pointed to the small circle first, then to herself. Then she pointed to the surrounding ones, shaking her head, her expression shadowed. Elias's heart tightened. He understood her meaning. Her people were few, surrounded by many who were hostile. They had once gone to the stars, but the stars had turned against them. So they had hidden, retreating to this forest world. But why show him this? Why trust him with such a secret? As the day went on, Elias and Leora worked to share more. He drew stars in his journal, marking Earth's sun and the nearby colonies. She studied them carefully, her brow furrowed. She drew her own map. Different stars, lines connecting them, many crossed out. Elias realized with a cold shiver that her people had once traveled far, maybe farther than humans had yet. But they had been pushed back, hunted, forced into silence. At last, Leora closed his journal gently and pushed it toward him. She shook her head. The message was clear. Enough. She had shared more than she usually did. They sat in silence. Elias listened to the wind through the ruins. It carried a low hum, almost like voices speaking softly in the distance. He wondered if the stones themselves held memories. Leora rose to her feet. She pointed to the sky, then to him. Her eyes held, a warning. Elias understood. She was telling him he should not stay too long. Her people would not welcome him, but he also saw something else in her eyes, hesitation, as if a part of her wanted him to stay, wanted him to know more. Before leaving, she drew one last symbol in the dirt. It was a hand, open. Then she placed her own hand over it, pressing it flat. She looked at him, waiting. Elias slowly placed his own hand on the drawing too. Their palms did not touch, but the meaning was there, a promise perhaps. She nodded once, then walked away into the forest shadows. That night, Elias sat in his shuttle, writing everything down. He drew the ruins again, each picture carefully copied. He wrote notes about the dark figures, the maps, of the stars, the warning in her eyes. But most of all, he wrote her name again. Leora. As he closed the journal, a thought came to him. Humanity had always reached for the stars, always pushed outward. But what if the stars were not safe? What if the galaxy held secrets far older, far darker? He looked out the shuttle window at the glowing forest. Somewhere out there, Leora was watching, living in silence with her people. He wanted to see them, to understand them, but he also knew the risk. She had warned him. The next morning, he returned again. He did not expect her to come, but she did. This time, though, she was not alone. Two figures stood behind her, hidden, partly by the trees. They were like her, tall and pale, their eyes glowing faintly, but their expressions were sharper, colder. Leora raised her hand quickly, as though to calm them. She gestured to Elias, speaking in her language, her voice low but firm. The two figures did not move closer, but Elias could feel their eyes on him. They did not trust him. His chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell them he meant no harm, but his words would be empty, without understanding. So he did the only thing he could. He slowly crouched by the stream and touched the water, sending ripples outward. He looked at Leora, hoping she would understand the gesture. Her eyes softened. She crouched too, touching the water as before. The two figures behind her watched in silence. At last, one of them turned and walked away into the forest. The other followed slowly, still casting a long glance at Elias before vanishing between the trees. Leora remained. She looked at Elias, her face tense. Then, with a small sigh, she sat on the stone across from him. For a while, neither spoke or gestured. The silence was heavy now, filled with unseen eyes. Elias knew the truth. He was not only seen by her, he was seen by her people. At last, Leora lifted her hand to her chest. She spoke softly, repeating her name. Leora. Elias touched his chest. Elias. It was their ritual now, their fragile bridge. But in his heart, Elias felt the weight of what was coming. The secret of her people was no longer just hers to share. Others knew of him, and he could not guess whether they would allow this fragile bond to survive, or break it before it grew stronger. The stars rose again that night, bright and endless above the forest. Elias stood outside his shuttle, staring upward. Somewhere, beyond those stars, humanity lived and thrived, reaching further each year. But here, on this hidden world, he had found something greater than discovery. He had found trust, fragile and rare, and he feared how easily it could be lost. The forest felt different the next day. Elias noticed it as soon as he stepped outside his shuttle. The air was heavier, the glow of the trees softer, as though the world itself waited for something. He walked the familiar path to the stream, but his steps were slower. He had seen the two strangers the day before. Their eyes had been sharp, distrustful. Leora had stood between them and him, but Elias knew her presence alone could not protect him forever. When he reached the stream, Leora was already there. But this time she was not alone. 5 figures stood behind her, their tall forms half hidden by the silver light of the forest. Their skin glowed faintly like hers, but their eyes were colder. Their clothes were woven from strange fibers, patterned with lines that seemed to shift when he looked too long. Leora's expression was tense. She glanced at Elias, then turned to her people, speaking quickly in her language. The words were sharp, filled with weight. Elias could not understand, but he heard urgency in her tone. One of the taller figures stepped forward. His eyes glowed brighter than the rest. He looked at Elias with no kindness. He spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying across the stream like the sound of stone moving. Elias did not move. He only raised his hand slowly, showing he carried no weapon. "I don't mean harm," he said softly, though he knew they could not understand. The tall figure spoke again, sharper this time. Leora quickly stepped between them, holding up her hands. Her voice grew firm, louder, as if she argued against their judgment. Elias's heart raced. He had not wanted this. He had only wanted to know her, to understand her people. But now he stood judged as an intruder. The tall figure pointed at Elias, then at the forest, then made a sweeping gesture as if casting him out. Elias understood. They wanted him gone. He felt a weight press down on him. This world was theirs. He was an outsider. They had every right to send him away, but something inside him resisted. He could not leave like this, not without trying. Slowly, Elias crouched by the stream. He pulled his journal from his pack and opened it to the pages filled with drawings. The ruins, the carvings, the stars, and the two of them across the water. He held it up so they could see. The tall figure frowned, his eyes narrowing. Elias turned the pages one by one. He pointed to the stars he had drawn, then to himself. He touched his chest. "Elias," he whispered. Then he turned to the drawing of the stream where he had drawn himself and Leora. He pointed at both figures, then spread his hands open, a gesture of peace. The tall figure did not move. The silence stretched long. Then Leora stepped forward. She touched the journal gently, pointing to her figure in the drawing. "Leora," she said firmly, then touched Elias's drawing. "Elias." The others stirred, their expressions shifting. The tall leader frowned deeper, but his eyes flickered with thought. He spoke again, his words heavy, his tone commanding. Leora shook her head fiercely. She raised her hand and pointed at Elias, then touched her chest. She spoke quickly, her voice filled with strength. Elias realized she was defending him. She was standing for him before her people. The tall leader lifted his hand. The others fell silent. His glowing eyes fixed on Elias. For a long moment, Elias felt the weight of that gaze, like being measured on a scale unseen. Finally, the leader turned and spoke a single word. The others obeyed, stepping back into the forest shadows. Only Leora remained, her shoulders relaxing with relief. Elias let out the breath he had held. He did not know exactly what had been decided, but he was still here. Leora turned to him. She crouched and drew a symbol in the dirt, a circle with two smaller circles inside. She pointed to one, then to him, then to the other, then to herself. Finally, she connected them with a line. Elias stared at the drawing. Connection. A bond. She was telling him they were tied now, whether her people liked it or not. He touched his chest. Elias. She touched hers. Leora. For a moment, the forest felt lighter again. The days that followed were filled with quiet testing. Leora still met Elias at the stream, but sometimes others stood in the distance, watching silently. Their eyes were sharp, but they did not interfere. Elias did his best to show his intentions. He shared small things, a fire starter tool, a light from his wrist device, a simple water purifier. He explained with gestures, showing how they worked. Leora studied them with wide eyes, then carried the knowledge back to her people. Sometimes, she returned with things of her own, a woven cloth that shimmered like silver threads, a stone that glowed faintly in the dark, seeds that turned to flowers within moments when placed in soil. They exchanged gifts of knowledge, small steps toward understanding, but the shadow of distrust never left. Elias could feel it in the way the others watched him, in the way they whispered in their language when he passed. He was not welcome. Not yet. One evening, Leora brought him back to the ruins. The air was cooler, the stars bright overhead. She touched the carvings again, her face somber. Elias drew slowly in his journal. He sketched Earth, a simple circle with a smaller circle for its moon. He pointed to it, then to himself. He drew another circle for the sun, then lines of stars. He looked at her, hoping she would understand. His people lived beyond this world too. Leora studied the drawing for a long time. Then she placed her hand over the page, pressing it flat. She looked at him, her eyes shining faintly in the starlight. Elias understood her meaning. She was asking him to be careful, to hold back, to keep her people's secrets safe. He nodded, slowly. "I won't betray you," he whispered. Though she could not know his words, something in her eyes softened. She believed him. The next day, things changed. Elias was at the stream, waiting as usual. But when Leora arrived, she was not calm. Her steps were quick, her eyes filled with worry. She spoke in her language, her hands moving urgently. Elias could not understand, but he felt the tension in every word. Then he saw them, more figures in the forest moving closer. A whole group, 10 or more, their glowing eyes fixed on him. They surrounded the clearing. Leora stood in front of him, her arms spread wide. Her voice rose, sharp and strong, speaking words Elias could not know but could feel. She was pleading for him. The tall leader was among them. His gaze was harder now, filled with judgment. He pointed at Elias, his hand firm. Elias realized this was the moment. They would decide now if he could stay, or if he must leave forever. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by Leora's voice as she stood before him. Elias felt the weight of choice pressing down. He had no weapon, no power. All he had was his heart, his voice, and his truth. He stepped forward gently, placing a hand on his chest. "Elias," he said. Then he pointed at Leora. "Leora." He spread his hands open, showing nothing but peace. "Friend." The leader's eyes narrowed. The others whispered softly. Leora turned, looking at her people, her eyes shining with quiet fire. She spoke one final word, clear and strong, echoing through the ruins of the forest. The people fell silent. The leader did not answer at once. His gaze shifted between Elias and Leora, heavy with thought. At last he lowered his hand. He turned away, speaking a short command. Slowly the group began to retreat into the forest shadows. Leora stood still, her chest rising with deep breaths. She looked back at Elias, relief softening her face, for now he was allowed to stay. But Elias knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a choice. Hers, his, and her people's. A choice that could change both their worlds forever. The sun rose slowly over the glowing forest, painting the trees in soft gold and silver. Elias stepped outside his shuttle, carrying his journal and a small bag of tools. Today felt different. He could feel it in the air. Something important was about to happen. He walked the familiar path to the stream. The water sparkled faintly, ripples gliding over stones that reflected the sky above. Leora was already there, standing as always, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She gave him a small nod, then gestured for him to follow. Today she was taking him further. Beyond the stream, beyond the stone ruins, deeper into the forest than he had ever gone before. Elias followed silently, careful not to make a sound. The forest around them was alive with light and hum, but today it seemed even quieter, as if holding its breath. They came to a clearing unlike any he had seen. The ground was smooth, covered in a strange soft moss that glowed faintly underfoot. Around the edges of the clearing were dozens of figures, her people watching. Their glowing eyes shifted in unison, moving as Elias stepped forward. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He was finally meeting them fully. Leora stepped ahead of him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. She looked at her, people and spoke in her language. Elias could not understand the words, but he felt the tone. Soft, firm, respectful. The tall leader from before stepped forward. His glowing eyes locked on Elias. Elias took a deep breath, then slowly stepped onward. He raised his hands, showing that he carried no weapons. He pointed to himself. "Elias," he said softly. Then he pointed to Leora. "Leora." The forest was silent. Elias reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a simple fire starter. He held it up and activated it. A small flame flickered, warm and steady. Then he carefully held it closer to the moss, letting it light up without burning it. The glow spread across the clearing, soft and gentle. Her people murmured, a sound like wind moving through leaves. Elias smiled gently. He reached into his bag again, this time taking out a small water purifier. He poured a little water through it and let it drip into a leaf. The water came out clear, sparkling. He looked at the tall leader, hoping to show that he had come to help, not to harm. Leora stepped forward, gesturing toward Elias, then to the moss underfoot, then to the stream. She pointed to herself, then to him, then back at the people. Slowly she knelt, pressing her hand to the ground. Elias understood. She was showing them his intentions were true. He knelt too, placing his hands on the moss. He spoke softly. "Friend," he said. The leader's gaze softened slightly. He looked at his people, then at Elias. Finally, he stepped forward, his glowing eyes scanning every movement. He spoke in their language, low and measured. Leora nodded. Then he turned to Elias. Elias could not understand the words, but he felt the meaning. They would let him stay. Relief washed through him. He breathed deeply, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Leora's hand rested lightly on his arm. She smiled faintly, her eyes shining. For the first time, Elias saw a small smile from her people. Not wide, not open, but a recognition that he was not a threat. Over the next days, Elias worked quietly alongside Leora and her people. He showed them small ways to repair old devices in the ruins. He helped gather water safely, build small protective structures for the moss-covered stones, and even plant seeds that would grow quickly in the glowing soil. Each day, he learned more about her people. They were cautious, wise, and skilled, even if their eyes held sadness from past betrayal. They had retreated from the stars for a reason, yet they were curious about him, fascinated by his knowledge and his willingness to help. Leora was always close, guiding him silently. Sometimes she would draw in the dirt, showing him a way to understand the symbols on the stone ruins. Sometimes she would bring him gifts, a small glowing flower, a piece of smooth stone, or seeds that could bloom in moments. Elias cherished every gesture. He learned quickly that trust was slow, delicate, and fragile. Every word, every action mattered. He could not rush it. One evening, Leora led him back to the clearing, where they had first met her people fully. The stars were bright overhead. The moss underfoot glowed faintly, illuminating the clearing like soft lanterns. Her people gathered, watching silently. Leora stepped forward and spoke in their language. Elias could not understand, but the tone was strong, clear, and commanding. Then she gestured to him, holding her hand toward his chest. Elias stepped forward. He raised his hands and spoke softly. "Elias." Then he pointed to her. "Leora." She smiled faintly. The people murmured again, softer this time. Then finally, one of the elder figures, tall, glowing softly, stepped forward. He looked at Elias closely. His gaze was steady, searching. Elias held his breath. The elder extended a hand, palm up. Elias hesitated for a moment, then placed his hand over it. Their palms did not touch fully, but the gesture was understood. A bond had been formed. The people murmured softly, a sound like wind in leaves. Elias felt it deep in his chest. He had earned their trust. Leora stepped closer, placing her hand over his. Together they looked at the stars overhead. The forest was silent, peaceful, filled with soft light. Elias finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "Thank you," he said. Leora touched his shoulder lightly, smiling. Over the next days, Elias became part of their life in small ways. He did not force his presence, but offered help wherever it was needed. He repaired small devices in the ruins, helped carry water, and taught simple ideas about human technology. The people watched, learning slowly, cautiously. In return, they shared their knowledge, Leora showed him how to read the stone symbols, how to understand the patterns of the glowing moss, and how to sense the subtle energies of the forest. Elias marveled at their skill. He realized that humans had reached for the stars, yes, but her people had done so long before him. And yet, he also realized something more important. Humanity had something that could not be measured in technology or strength: trust, courage, and the ability to form bonds even with beings very different from themselves. One quiet night, Elias and Leora sat by the stream. The water sparkled. Under the starlight, ripples moving gently past their hands. Elias looked at her, his heart full. "Leora," he whispered. She smiled faintly, eyes bright. "Elias," she replied softly, her voice like wind over silver stones. He reached into his pack and drew a small picture in his journal, a drawing of the two of them, the stream, the ruins, and the glowing forest around them. He placed it gently, in front of her. She touched the drawing, then pressed her hand to her chest. Elias did the same. "Friend," he said softly. Her eyes shone. "Friend," she repeated. The forest around them seemed to sigh in relief. The air was softer, the glow gentler, as if the world itself approved of the bond now formed. From that night onward, Elias was no longer only a visitor. He was a guest, a friend, and a bridge between worlds. He had crossed the silence between humans and her people. He had proven that trust could grow, even where fear had lived for centuries, and somewhere deep in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The stars above were endless, shining bright. The forest was alive with light, hum, and quiet energy. Elias and Leora stood together by the stream, watching the night. The galaxy was vast, full of secrets, danger, and wonder. But in this small hidden world, he had found something rare and precious: trust, friendship, and hope. And it had all begun with a whispered truth and a single turning glance.